One of the things I've discovered is that this section is too thick, but also not accessible. Like I can't easily carve up into it. And so what I'm going to do is essentially the technique that we would use for solid sculpture. I'm going to cut some of this off. And so to get a sense of how I could cut it off, I could cut it straight off the top like this. I could cut through the wall down here, and that way I could carve up into it, or I could slice it in half. I think the angle that's going to get me the easiest access to it, even though the cut is a little bit more complex, is something like that, where I essentially cut through. And actually, I started to come in the front. I think I'm going to come in the back, just because that's going to give me a little bit more access. So I'm going to try to do a cut that comes up like this. Now, one of the things you want to do when you're doing a cut, I've marked it in with my needle tool, but more importantly, I'm going to give myself a key. So a key is a set of lines, or a single line, a line, or triangle. I've done a double, a single, and a double here. And those are going to help me when I cut through this. Those are going to help me get it keyed up again later on. Now this is leather hard, so it hasn't started to change color. The whole piece is about leather hard. The tip is a bit drier, in part because I took the plastic off for a while. I could wire through, but I imagine that when I push on the top, I'm probably going to squish this. So I think I'm going to use a knife. So I'm going to hold this up here so it's supported, and I'm going to bring that knife down into the clay. And then the tricky bit is going to be that at some point I need to turn this. So I'm going to turn this cut around and cut this section off. Now if I've cut all the way through, what I should end up with is this section here. And I've cut through the top because I wasn't paying attention to how low I got. But what this gives me access to now is I'm going to be able to cut away some of this extra clay that otherwise would have been really hard to get to. I'm going to mark in essentially where I'm cutting. And that's a pretty good distance to cut if I'm not going to do any faceting. I almost forgot, but I actually plan to do a little bit of faceting on the outside. So I'm going to make that cut a little less deep so it gives me more room to work with on the outside. All right. And then I do pretty much need to switch to either a small loop tool, or if my shape is right, I may be able to get away with cutting this section out. Just as long as I don't go through the wall there, or at least getting started. So I've cut some of that out. Probably want to work on refining it a little bit, either with my loop tool or with a knife. And I often put this on my lap when I'm carving, and so one of the things that's kind of interesting is working with this in front of the camera and trying to keep it at an angle where you can see it makes it a little bit harder for me to see it. All right. One of the other things people often do when they do this kind of cut is they smooth that inside edge with their finger, just to make sure that, or you could use a rubber tip, just to make sure that it's doesn't have any air pockets, doesn't have any rips and stuff like that. Makes it a little bit stronger anytime you can compress the clay. Now, one of the things you also notice is that my walls haven't shifted, or at least they haven't shifted much, and I've left the key marks visible. I'm going to do the same thing over here to this top section. Try to get my hands out of the way of the camera. So I'm going to cut that down, trying to leave some extra thickness. And the only tricky thing, oops, don't go too far. The only tricky thing now is I can't quite get in the back. Oh, yeah, it worked out okay. I probably took a little too much off the front. I got to keep track of that as I go to put this back together. All right, so now what I've got is a piece on the bottom and a piece on the top that have been hollowed out. And if you can see, I can put them back together and they line up, but obviously they're not attached. So I'm going to want to grab a scoring tool and some slip, and I'm going to want to score these up really well. So, oh, you have a different scoring tool. Serrated rib, knife if you're in a pinch, you can always score like this. Or other variations on scoring tools. If I could find my serrated rib, I would use that right now, but I'm not sure where it is. Got too many things going on at once here. So I'm going to score this. I'm going to score this one. And then if I can find some slip, it's important to use slip and not just try to stick these together because the clay is leather hard. If I were to simply do that, they are not going to stick together very well. I've got to bring over some liquid slip, and mine's a little watery. I just had to make new today, and I put in too much water. I want this nice thick stuff at the bottom, or if yours isn't as watery as mine, that's the glue, and that's what's going to help this actually stick together. If you're in a pinch, water can work, but you're going to have to work a little bit harder on sealing stuff to, pushing and securing stuff together. Vinegar is also something sometimes people use, or a slip made out of vinegar. If you've got cracks that are developing, a slip made out of, instead of water, you take your bone dry and you slake it into vinegar. Stinks to high heaven, not very pleasant in that respect, but it's really good at securing the seam. So now I've got a visible seam here, and I'm going to want to work on smoothing that. I'm just doing it with my finger to begin with, but I'm going to go get a rib and work on compressing that. Again, compression, just like when on the inside, compression is going to make that clay stronger. And the idea is that by the time this is done, you're not going to be able to see that there was a seam there. The other thing is, remember, leather hard, wet, and leather hard are going to dry at different rates. If you let this dry completely uncovered right now, you potentially run into getting a crack right there. So make sure this whole thing, at least the top, but really the whole thing, dries covered in plastic for at least a day or two after you've done something like that where you've mixed amount of wetness.